Hi team, welcome to the second video for monetary policy where we will speak about conventional monetary policy. So you need to understand what conventional monetary policy is, and specifically this is about the cash rate target. We then want to understand how it affects interest rates, okay? Now, to juxtapose conventional monetary policy, in the next video you will look at a form of unconventional monetary policy. So really what we're about to look at now is the main vehicle that the RBA used to obviously manipulate interest rates, okay? So conventional monetary policy, i.e. looking to target a specific cash rate, is done through a process called open market operations. So your job after watching this video is to make sure that in your mind, conventional monetary policy is lined up against this new term, open market operations, okay? We sometimes refer to open market operations as OMOs for short. And so just making sure that in your mind, right, OMOs refers to that conventional monetary policy that I need to speak to, okay? So conventional monetary policy consists of OMOs where the RBA employs a process to manipulate the cash rate. Now, in my previous video, we had a look at the historical cash rate in Australia, and I said that we would talk about how the change in the cash rate is going to then influence interest rates, and that's what we're going to speak about today. So in essence, the RBA doesn't directly control interest rates, okay? Commercial banks control interest rates. So we're talking about Commonwealth Bank of Australia or Westpac. Banks will be the entity that have direct control over the interest rates that they offer in the economy. However, they are underpinned by the cash rate, okay? So changes to the cash rate by the Reserve Bank of Australia will then go on to influence the interest rates that are offered in the commercial setting, as in the interest rates that are offered by banks, okay? And this is the most commonly used tool by the Reserve Bank of Australia to influence aggregate demand. Okay, so before we get into the nuts and bolts of how OMOs work, we need to get our head around this new terminology, treasury bonds, okay? So treasury bonds are issued by the Reserve Bank of Australia and they are purchased by investors, okay? So you can see a little image on the side. It's literally a certificate. It has the word bond on it, and it has a particular value associated with it, okay? So the RBA create them and issue them, and investors sell them. Now let's break that down for a moment. Why would an investor purchase a treasury bond? There must be something in it for them, right? They're looking to invest their money. So by purchasing a bond, there must be some kind of kickback, okay? So a bond is a low risk, low reward financial asset. And when you purchase it, when the investor purchases the treasury bond from the RBA, it includes a commitment from the central bank, from the RBA, to pay periodic interest to the holder of the bond, all right? So if I buy a bond from the Reserve Bank of Australia, I am purchasing a commitment from the RBA for them to pay me interest on a periodic basis. So I might buy a bond that's worth $1,000 and I might be paid a return of 3% annually, okay? So instead of leaving my money in the bank where it's maybe not going to do anything, I might decide to invest my money into treasury bonds. I purchase those bonds from the RBA. They issue the bonds to me. I get a physical piece of paper that says, here's your bond. And then for as long as I hold that bond, I'm going to get a set return, hypothetically maybe 3%, 4%, 5%. Obviously the numbers are going to be different depending on the government that you're looking at, the length of the bond, all those kinds of things. But effectively, think of it as a financial asset, and you choose to invest in it. And by investing in it, you're going to be paid a rate of return from the issuer. In this case, we're talking about the Reserve Bank of Australia, okay? So we'll work that one in. If you need to, make sure you hit stop and rewind before we move on. Okay, so we're talking about OMOs again, so open market operations, which is the tightening of monetary policy in this respect. If we're trying to tighten monetary policy, we're trying to reduce economic activity. We're trying to decrease aggregate demand because maybe we've got some issues with inflation. So this is what's going on at the moment in Australia. So let's assume that the Reserve Bank of Australia decides to tighten monetary policy. It wants to do so by increasing the cash rate. So if you increase the cash rate, we know that that's going to lead to an increase in the interest rate, and that's obviously going to make it more difficult for people to borrow money, which means we should see a decrease in consumption spending, a decrease in investment spending, and that's ultimately going to reduce aggregate demand. And at the moment, we know that because inflation's gotten away from us, this is what the RBA is seeking to achieve, okay? So it will sell bonds to individuals within the Australian economy. Let's say that again. The RBA is going to sell bonds to individuals, investors within the Australian economy, and they do so to decrease the supply of money in the market. So the RBA create treasury bonds. They then sell them to investors in the Australian market. The Australian investors have to pay money to the RBA in order to facilitate that transaction. And so what happens is the RBA is effectively able to take money out of the economy. And if they take money out of the economy, have a look at our graph on the left, this is the money market, the supply of money will shift from S money 1 to S money 2. It's a decrease in supply, okay? Now the line is vertical instead of obviously on an angle like normal, because at any given point in time, the money supply is fixed, okay? There's only one body that are able to obviously create more money, and that is the RBA. So they're the only producer, and so you've got a nice vertical supply curve. So by selling treasury bonds to investors and those investors paying money to the RBA to purchase those bonds, we're going to see a decrease in the supply of money in the Australian economy, and that's going to shift the supply curve to the left. Now, let's just follow our normal supply and demand curve theory. What we will start to see is a shortage of money at CR1. We call it the cash rate 1. And that's going to put upward pressure. Traditionally, we talk about upward pressure on prices. In this case, we're going to talk about upward pressure on the cash rate. Okay, the cash rate being obviously the cost of borrowing money. And so what basically happens, guys, is because there's a decrease in the money supply, we see an increase in the cash rate. Because there's less money available, it becomes more scarce. It therefore, you know, from an economic perspective, is more difficult to come by. It's going to put upward pressure on prices. But we don't put a price on money. We measure the price of money based on the cash rate, okay? So that's explained here. This decreases the supply, creating a shortage, and this puts upward pressure on the price of money, thus the cash rate increases. So think of this as a typical microeconomic analysis where there is a decrease in supply, which puts upward pressure on prices. But instead of using the term prices, we're obviously speaking about the cash rate. So this is the tightening of monetary policy. Now for commercial banks, they will see this, okay? And this is a signal to commercial banks, so Commonwealth Bank, Westpac, whoever. This is a signal to commercial banks that they now need to increase their interest rates, and they will do so, okay? Banks obviously, would prefer to increase their interest rates because it means that they're going to be able to be paid higher interest repayments from their customers, and they're going to make more money. And then that sweeps through our economy in the sense that now interest rates are higher. How is that going to impact aggregate demand? Okay, so this is how OMOs operate with respect to tightening monetary policy. This story here is the same, it just goes in the complete opposite direction. So this is not currently relevant to us, okay? Loosening of monetary policy refers to a reduction in interest rates, and that's obviously for the purpose of stimulating aggregate demand. That is not what is happening in Australia at the moment, but obviously during the pandemic, we certainly saw a huge loosening of monetary policy down to as low as 0.1%. Okay, so let's quickly run through what loosening of monetary policy looks like through OMOs. So assume the RBA decides to loosen monetary policy and decrease the cash rate. It's going to go back into the market and buy those bonds from individuals within the Australian economy. Okay, so you've got to imagine that OMOs have, obviously been around for a long time, and there's a lot of treasury bonds that are out there. The RBA will go into the market and buy those treasury bonds back off investors. So they'll give the money to the investor to purchase the bond back. Obviously, the investor then receives the money, receives the cash. And so we see an increase in the supply of money in the Australian economy. So the increase in the supply creates a surplus of cash at CR1, cash rate 1. And simple supply and demand microeconomics, we're going to see downward pressure on prices, which will create a decrease in that cash rate, okay? So guys, this is, like I said at the start, the exact same story as tightening of monetary policy. It just goes in the complete opposite direction, okay? And that's it. Thank you.